The lovely Sandy, as she said, I'm Barbara Ann Wright. I'm a writer and editor for Bold Strokes Books. And this is the art of the tease, where we're going to talk about stuff that keeps people reading. Hint, it's sex scenes. So I'm going to introduce our lovely panelists real quick. Some of them sent me bios, some of them didn't. So we'll see what we wind up with. Let's start first with Nanisi, if you can give a little wave. There she is. She started writing in 3rd grade as a way to earn books from a local newspaper. She wrote her first novel, she says in quotes, when she was 10, but it wasn't until 1995 that she had one published. Mainly a musician, she played piano and conducted choruses, bands, and orchestras. She and Kay Gardner founded the New England Women's Symphony in 1968. She has traveled around the world a few times and loves to write about other countries. Next, we have Erin Dutton. She resides in Nashville, Tennessee with her wife. They enjoy traveling with their much doted on dog. In 2007, she published her first book, Sequestered Hearts, and has kept writing since. She's a proud recipient of the 2011 Alice B. Reader's Appreciation Medal for her body of work. When not working on writing, she enjoys playing golf, photography, and spending time with friends and family. PJ Trebelhorn. There she is. PJ Trebelhorn was born and raised in Portland, Oregon, and still considers it home. She now lives in the Buffalo, New York area with her wife, who she's been with for 24 years, legally married for 6. Aww. She spends her time playing with their 3 cats and 1 dog, playing PlayStation and computer games, reading, writing, and watching too much Netflix, though not necessarily in that order. There is no such thing as too much Netflix. Renee Roman. She dances under the stage name Nottingham Naughtiness. She has twice won the Golden Tassel Award for her breathtaking, death-defying burlesque performances. She also writes books sometimes. Her newest release, Bonded Love, came out in June. And last but certainly not least, Radclyffe. Radclyffe once danced under the name The Centerfold Surgeon. Now she owns a chain of clubs that are libraries by day and burlesque clubs at night. She sometimes also writes books with over 50 romance and romantic intrigue novels, dozens of short stories, and writing as L.L. Rand has authored a paranormal romance series, The Midnight Hunters. A fabulous group of people here. This is going to be really interesting. We're totally going to talk about burlesque the whole time. But no, what we're going to talk about is the things that make readers want to read a book or to keep reading. So let's just dive right in here and ask everybody about the ultimate tease, and that is the book blurb. So what makes a good tease in your book blurbs? Do you focus on romance, conflicts, life or death situations? And I'm going to toss that one right out there to PJ because she's looking at me.
It's kind of difficult at times because you want to tell people what the story's about, but not give away too much. I just try to romance mostly. If there is a big conflict, then I might mention it in a blurb, but usually it's just focused on the romance.
Awesome. Centerfold Surgeon, what about you?
I think, well, Sandy's not here to correct me, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. Our blurbs are limited to 150 words because they have to fit on the back of the book, below the bio and above whatever little other stuff we have to put on. So you don't have a lot of room to actually write your blurb. I'm a romance writer. I definitely try to get both of the characters' names in there so that people kind of know that there's 2 characters who are going to be featured in the story. I try to use a few words to describe who they are, and I definitely try to put in a hint of what their conflict or their challenge will be. So if I'm writing an intrigue or a paranormal and there's a big fight between the 2 werewolf clans, then I'm going to try to put that in. So the reader has a sense of what the ride is going to be like.
Awesome. How about you, Nanisi?
Well, I write all sorts of things, and I started out writing mysteries. And you do that, and you put in a little bit of what's going to happen and where they're looking for the clues. You don't give it away. You just put a little bit of each in there. Who the heroine is and what her challenge is.
That's good. Nottingham Naughtiness?
Well, as Sandy can attest, the blurb always gives me a hard time. I don't know why, but it's integral to introduce, I think, the characters, at least give their names and maybe their occupations. And I write romance, so something about who they are, or a little bit about their struggles and their deepest desires. Because we all know it's going to be a happily ever after. That's what we're writing. So, or at least a happy for now. And so I don't feel the need to put that part in, but I definitely struggle with getting in the important things in 150 words.
I think we all do that. What about you, Erin?
Oh, I mean, all the other answers are hitting it on the head. One thing that kind of comes to mind is the fact that, for me anyway, the book is contracted before I've finished writing it, sometimes before I've even started writing it. So the first draft of the blurb is written when I don't really have, the whole entire story mapped out. So it is good that it's kind of brief and making sure that it's general enough that while you're writing, things can evolve, but also specific enough to bring in your target reader.
It might be a little too much to admit to your publisher that you don't know what you're doing from the beginning, but I think we can all identify that with one way or the other.
I'm pretty sure she already knows.
If it wasn't the case for me too, I mean, I generally have to tweak my blurb a little bit, which doesn't make a lot of people happy because, it's already gone out. But sometimes I really do have to change something that I put in there, and it's not something you want to count on being able to do because it's a real pain. Once it goes out to the distributors, it's a big deal to change the blurb. But the blurb is one of the most important marketing tools that the author has at hand, that the author has control over. And it's probably, after looking at the cover, the second thing a reader will look at, and they will often decide right there if they're going to read that book or not, based on what's in the blurb. The blurb is absolutely one of the 3 critical marketing tools. So it's really important. Fortunately, Sandy works with everyone on their blurbs, and she's an expert at making them better.
I agree with that, yeah. Oh, sort of jumping off of that, some of you, not all of you, write erotic romances or have written erotic romances or short stories. How do you designate, let's say, a spicy level in the blurb? I mean, when you're doing kind of a will they, won't they, but how do you let the reader know what kind of a romance they're in for? Let's see, who wants to take that one? Who looks like they're not thinking too hard about it? That's Rad.
I'll go first. I don't want to take it completely. I think that's really tough. I think if you're a well-known author, then most people kind of know what your heat level is. Certainly, if you're writing an erotic romance, meaning not a book with a lot of sex, but a book in which the sex is an integral part of the story, that the journey is a sexual journey, you're going to want to get that in the blurb pretty specifically. So, I think that's really an important signal to send. I think if you're a first-time author, there's not really a great way to do that other than to allude to the fact that perhaps their physical attraction is one of the major things that happens.
I don't really convey that in the blurbs. I don't write erotica. I don't know. It's it's the romance part for me that I write about in the blurb.
Well, that's okay. I didn't give them this question ahead of time, so I think I'm going to get probably a lot of hate mail for this one. Renee, do you have anything to add?
My next novel, Body Language, is an erotic romance, and it was probably a little bit easier for me to describe the relationship between the 2 characters in that blurb than it was, because there was a solid piece that I could include, just like saying it's a romance kind of is a solid piece in a contemporary romance. Saying that the sex or the attraction between the 2 characters is going to play an important part in the story and not that I didn't have Sandy's help, because I certainly did, but that was a little easier because I knew the story, and I had quite a bit in my head of what the story was going to be about. So that blurb tended to be easier for me.
Erin?
Yeah, I mean, like Rad said, you kind of, when you read one of my books, you know what you're getting. I tend to write sweeter romances, less erotic sex scenes, I guess. I mean, they're on the page, but I've written a couple of erotica short stories, but they were included in an anthology that was, identified pretty clearly. In thinking about Bold Strokes books, I think, honestly, we probably identify, and correct me if I'm wrong, anybody, but we probably identify the spicier books more with the cover than with the blurb. I'm thinking about just a few of the covers of, our more spicy books. And I think that visually you can get something across with the cover that kind of gives a hint as to that level.
Well, I think that's definitely true. I mean, I think the covers for an erotic romance, we try to make them very obviously sexy covers. And I think there are keywords that you would use, regardless of what your genre might be, to signal to the reader what the genre is. And if you're writing an erotic romance, if you're writing a BDSM work, for example, then certainly the word power is going to show up. I mean, there are keywords that trigger genre conventions that readers, they may not consciously be aware of them, but they'll see that and they'll know that this is something they're interested in reading or not. And you do it with mysteries and with every genre that you write. And so we'll be looking for those keywords too when we review the blurbs. So I think that's part of it.
Well, that sort of leads me into my next question too, which is about covers. We've talked a little bit about what makes a good cover, and y'all just mentioned what makes an erotic cover maybe different than a sweet romance cover. What sort of covers draw you in as readers, and do you think about that when choosing your own cover for your books? Erin.
What sort of covers draw me in? I think I like, there's been a trend lately to putting people, women specifically in our genre, on the front of the book. And I don't mind that, but I don't require it because I'm already, when I'm reading, I'm forming in my mind what they look like anyway. So I tend to like more dramatic covers maybe, or something that just where there's something in the image that catches your eye. And as far as my own covers, I think I do lean more away from people on the covers, unless it's silhouette or something where it leaves a little bit still to the reader's imagination. Although I do think once they get into the story, the image on the cover can kind of change in their head. But I write a lot of first responders books, so bold colors, something that symbolizes the fire services or police officers or something like that is typically what you'll see on my covers.
Awesome. What about you, Rad?
Well, I think author name is key. I think that for an established author, I think that making sure the author name is prominent, that sounds really simple, but most readers have favorite authors or always reads. So it's very important that to brand the author's name in a certain way and make sure it's prominent. And when I'm scanning through in my e-reader and I'm looking at new releases, I'm going to pick out the authors that I'm, familiar with right away. And I don't really care what the image is on the cover. If it's a Faith Hunter, Jane Yellow Rock, paranormal vampire hunter, I'm going to read it. I think that for our covers, a lot depends on what the genre is. And for me personally, I like to signal something about the book, obviously. I mean, if it's a medical romance, I'm probably, like Erin said, probably going to feature something that says medical romance, a hospital or something like that. I don't care so much whether I have people or not people on my covers. If I'm doing a paranormal, I do like to have an image because I think that's very conventional. I think that you have to look at the covers that are out there in the world, in the genre that you write, because your readers are reading everything and they're looking at covers everywhere. And so it says, like, what are the covers like for what I'm writing now? To signal to the reader, if they don't know you, this is what this book is about. again, it's another one of those signals that when they're scanning 20 books they don't know, you want them to stop at yours because it's something they like to read.
Okay. Renee.
With this, I actually went through a whole stack of books that I had recently either read or wanted to read or put on my list to read, which are thousands. But all of the ones that I'm drawn to are clear images of what's inside. They are not hard to visually pick out what's going on. They are bright and attract my attention. I like the title to be up front. I don't want to have to search in the picture to find it. Same thing with the author. I want to know right away when I look at it who it's by, what it's about, and what the title is. And for my own books, I try to include something important that I feel is paramount to relay to the reader what my book is about.
PJ.
I tend to not look at the cover as much as what the blurb tells me about the book. I mean, the ones that I am more drawn to are kind of brighter in color and, you know, have the name of the author and a picture of what might be in the book. But the cover isn't usually what draws me in, it's the blurb.
Nice. What about you, Nani? Can you hear us, Nanisi?
Covers are hard for me because I want to tell a lot about my story, but not too much. I was just looking at a cover, choosing a cover the other day, and the story goes all around the world. But one thing that started it was a yellow bikini. So it's not a major part of the story, but I saw a picture of a yellow bikini, or part of a yellow bikini. And I thought, that's interesting. Let's go with that.
Okay. Well, let's jump inside the book and talk about the teasing to keep people reading. So say at the end of the chapters, do you like to end chapters with cliffhangers, maybe that keep your readers awake at night? And can this be overused, or should we not ever let our readers sleep? And let's start out first with PJ.
I usually don't end with cliffhangers. I usually end the chapter with a thought from one of the characters about what might happen. I don't know. I mean, I guess it would be good to not ever let the reader sleep. I don't know.
Well, if the thought you end with is, you know, should I go on a stabbing spree or not? I think people are going to keep reading after that. Renee, is that what you use?
I don't use cliffhangers, but I definitely try to end with a what if kind of thing, where the character, the POV character, is actually questioning what they should do. Like, I don't even have an example for you, but definitely something that, oh, well, now I want to know kind of thing. And I'm okay with keeping the reader up for a while. Hopefully where they stop is after a less tension-filled scene where they can go, oh, okay, this would be a good place for me to go to bed and come back to it tomorrow.
That's nice of you, I think. It's very considerate.
Thank you. Yeah, I try.
What about you, Rad?
I try to end a chapter on a high note. And it may be, I mean, if I'm writing an action adventure or romantic intrigue where I really do have action scenes, then I may end it on what you would call a cliffhanger, in the sense that you have to read the next page to find out what happened. But I will always try to end at a high emotional moment, which might be an emotional feeling, as Renee was saying. It might be two characters in a situation which is emotionally compelling, so that the reader wants to know, what are they going to do next? I mean, I always want the reader to get to the end of the chapter with the question in their mind, is she going to do this, or what's going to happen to her next? So, and I'd be very happy if they turn the next page, even if they're really tired, just to read the first couple paragraphs of the next chapter, because I think that's the kind of pace that you want to have. You never want to let a chapter end on a downswing.
Nanisi, what about you?
I'm really bad with cliffhangers, and the end of my chapters are, yes, you want to read more. You come to a breathing point where you can get to the chapter and go, oh, now what happens next?
Nice. How about you, Erin?
Yeah, I think pretty much the same. One of the earliest lessons that I learned from my editor, Shelley, was how important it is to pay attention to where you leave a chapter. What is the last paragraph, sentence, whatever of that chapter? And I do try to leave it at a point where there's still a question or something to turn the page. I mean, I have tried to balance it in the past where if we're coming out of a very emotional scene, or that chapter has been kind of a big arc, then I do maybe try to leave that one in a little more peaceful place than some of the other ones. But mostly it's thinking about, how does this paragraph lead them to the next chapter?
That's nice.
Something that I find when I go back, when I finish a chapter and I read through it, I will often find that I've written one sentence too much. And I often end up trimming off the last sentence because I know the story and I know what the characters are thinking. I sometimes put too much at the very end of the chapter. And sometimes you want to keep that little nugget for going forward into the next chapter. It's just an interesting little thing to look at the very end of your chapters.
When you've written one like that, do you think to yourself, oh, this one's going to get me some emails?
No.
No, you bring it on. Have any of you ever ended a book on a cliffhanger? Like if you've written a series, ended a book on a cliffhanger? Anybody? Yes. No, everybody's no. Everybody's no. Yeah, I made that mistake one time.
You know, I haven't written a series and I haven't ended any book on a cliffhanger, but I did have one book, Reluctant Hope, where I left the book with a character maybe or maybe not facing a pretty serious health situation. And I did not divulge at the end of that book which way it went. And I did get some emails about that, but surprisingly, quite a few positive emails where people said that it wasn't integral to the happy ending. So they were glad that I didn't reveal which way it went.
That's nice if you can get those people to defend you from the people who are writing the not so happy emails.
It depends on what you're writing, I think. There've been some really, really good, especially in the paranormal field area, where, you know, you've got self-contained story in each book, but the greater arc continues through 5 books. And I think you can put cliffhangers in there in a series like that, as long as you've completed the story arc that you've got contained in that one book. It is frustrating because you've got to wait sometimes 6 months, a year, sometimes 2 years for the story to continue, which is really annoying. But it's pretty common in grimdark fantasies and paranormal fantasies. You see that all the time. But I don't think that you wouldn't want to do that. Well, you can't do it in a romance because then, well, you just can't. I mean,
Yeah.
You can't end the book that way. You know, Allie did it well because I made her split the book. Because, you know, when she sent in her very first manuscript, it was like 900 pages long or something. And it's like, I really like this, but no, it's way too long. So then she really did, you know, and there is a cliffhanger in The Devil Inside, but it works.
Well, I think you're right. I think people are more accepting of it, and anything that's very action oriented, especially if you're like, okay, I'm building up to a long plot here. I'm going to need more than one book to wrap all this up. But as long as you keep like a little wrap up, then maybe not so many emails, but still emails.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's talk about teasing in readings, doing live readings. What sort of readings do you pick to entice people to keep going? And how do you choose one that doesn't give away too much plot? Let us start with Erin.
I kind of employ a similar idea to what I just talked about with chapters. I find a sentence or an idea that's a good place to end the reading, and then I go backwards from there and find a good place to start. And then time it out and make sure the time works. And I've actually had some really good ending places that I haven't been able to use because I couldn't find a good beginning place that made sense for the time and structure of that panel or that reading. But typically I'm most focused on where am I going to end? Am I going to end at a point that, number one, either leaves the reader saying, I have to read that book and find out what happened, or, you know, really kind of draws them in and gives them a reason to want to seek out more from that book. And then it's really more just figuring out the balance of dialogue versus prose, because nobody wants to hear you read 20 pages of dialogue, or I don't want to read 20 pages of dialogue, I should say. So it's really just finding something that's balanced in that.
What about you, Rad?
I really struggle picking out things to read. I don't want to give away anything critical in the story. And since I'm writing romances, there are scenes I can't read. I tend to do the first meet because I think that introduces the two characters, but there are still a lot of questions. There's usually a hint at what the conflict is going to be. So I like to try to give the reader a sense of who are the main characters in this story. If I'm writing a romantic intrigue, I may, as Erin was alluding to, I may do a more action-oriented scene that leaves it at a point where it's like, well, what's going to happen? And I think that, and again, as Erin said, the balance between narrative and dialogue is really important. You don't want to have too many characters because they're hard to keep track of. You don't want a lot of long descriptive paragraphs because it's hard to follow. So you need a nice balance between the two when you pick out your excerpt.
Do you cut a lot when you do an excerpt? Do you tailor?
I do tailor. I think that was something I wanted to mention too. There's a big difference between reading a book and listening to a book. And I really appreciate it now that I'm actually the production manager for all of the audiobooks. You know, there are things that you don't have to say when you're reading a book out loud, but there are things you do have to say that if you want to keep people straight, you know, who's talking, sometimes you have to put in Reese said, where you wouldn't in the book because you can follow the conversation. And I will sometimes cut out a little bit of the narrative if I find that it might be important to describe the setting in the book, but the listeners don't have to hear it. So I always edit my excerpts a little bit.
How about you, TJ?
I just write romance, so I tend to pick for readings the first meeting of the two characters, and because I know it won't give away a whole lot, but it's just showing them how the two people meet and maybe what they think of each other at that first meeting.
Renee?
I usually read somewhere between the first and fourth, maybe pushing into the fifth chapter, but that's kind of rare. A quick look at both characters in their natural setting. I definitely trim out the extra narrative or things that, again, like Rad said, you don't need as much detail when you're reading out loud as you do or prefer. At least as a reader, I prefer to have a little more narrative so that I know I can picture in my mind what's happening. But for a 5-minute reading, you don't necessarily need that. And I try to stay to 5 minutes just because there are times when you go too far, I think, for me. I've done it in the past, and I've been like, God, you should have just stopped. You should have just stopped a few minutes earlier and left it. But I also like to give some emotional insight into both characters.
Well, as the great Melissa Braden has told us, if you read over 6 minutes, half of your audience just dies.
Right.
So that's a bunch of sales lost right there.
Yeah, you really don't want that to happen.
No, you don't. What about you, Nanisi?
Well, I haven't read in a long time because I turned down. I'm not a good reader. I try to get the scene where things start to happen, but not really happen, but what's going through in my person's head, where things start really looking up.
Okay.
It's gotta be something that will push the whole thing forward. People say, "Oh, that's interesting."
Yeah, I gotta go buy that. Yeah, right now I gotta find out what happened. Okay, let's take some questions from the gallery. Here's one. How do you make the decision of when and where to put sex into your manuscript versus just a tease or a fade to black scene? And I'm guessing they're talking about descriptive sex or graphic sex there. Who would like to go first with that one? Any volunteers?
I'll
Of
go.
course not. Oh, go, Renee.
Well, I personally don't really like fade to blacks. It's not why I read romance. I enjoy reading sex scenes, well done sex scenes, not just plopped in there for the hell of it and just to say, oh look, these two people are having sex.
Well, nobody wants that.
Well, no, of course not.
No. The word plop should never come into just your sex scene.
But that's important to me, is to give that kind of a connection between the two characters that feels like that's where they should be at this point. And whether it's shortly after they meet or whether it's much later in the book, I have to kind of go with my gut. And sometimes I've moved scenes back and sometimes I've moved them forward. It just has to feel organic to me.
Anybody else want to take a crack at that one? Nanisi, you're nodding.
I agree with organic. It has to come naturally. You can't just say, "Oh, okay, here we are. Let's have sex," because a lot of times that doesn't happen. It has to be.
Never
I mean,
happened to me. So yeah, I agree. That doesn't happen very often.
But just where it feels right, where it's leading.
Yes.
I think it depends, obviously, on what you're writing. If you're writing an erotic romance, then you're going to have sex a lot earlier in the book. And depending on how you construct your characters, regardless of what you're writing, you may have sex earlier in the book. I mean, I'm thinking of Above All Honor, which is one of my earlier works. And for me, the sexual personality of both characters was really critical to creating the relationship that they had. And there was a lot of sex in that book early on, not necessarily with each other. And for me, a sex scene, basically, the primary goal for a sex scene really is to develop character or to advance the romantic arc. I mean, those are the two reasons that you write a sex scene, and as well as making your readers happy if they read you because they like to read the sex that you write. But in terms of the structure of the work, it's either going to develop character or advance the romance arc. And for me, in Above All Honor, I used it to develop character very early on in the book. So there was sex in the first chapter. If I'm writing a different kind of work, like in the River series, where they're very character driven, and there's a lot of emphasis on the community and other characters, generally I don't get to the sex until probably 60 or 70% of the book. I just can't develop the characters enough and their interconnectedness for it to be organic, for it to feel like this is when they would have sex. They might be thinking about it, but they're probably not. So it really depends on the book that you're writing, the characters that you're writing, and the romance or the interpersonal relationship, if it's not a romance that you're writing. So it could be anywhere. Could be first chapter, could be last chapter. I'm not a fade to blacker. If I have an established couple in the book where they're not the primary characters, then I will often write a fade to black. You know they're having sex, but you've seen them have sex in the book before. But other than that, I've always, the reason I started writing lesbian fiction quite a long time ago is because I didn't think that the physical and sexual intricacies of our relationships were showing up enough in our fiction. And I wanted to write lesbian sex on the page.
It sounds like a non-erotic anthology is, you know, they're having sex. You don't need to see it.
Right.
PJ, what about you?
I don't do fade to black either. But the sex has to be in a part of the book where it makes sense. And when the two characters, for me, have gotten to know each other before they go ahead and just hop into bed.
Yeah, I agree. Erin?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everything that's been said. It needs to be authentic to the characters and to the story. You know, and the level of heat in it also needs to be authentic to the characters. You need to be able to believe that this is a character that would act that way. And not to say that people don't act uncharacteristically or what you would consider uncharacteristic in the bedroom, but it still needs to be believable for those characters.
Cool. Well, we've got another question here. Susie Clark says, in a previous podcast, Brad says it is important to describe what the characters are feeling rather than what they're actually doing in the sex scene. And she wonders if you could talk a little more about that. And we are going to ask everybody else to weigh in too. But let's start with Brad.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that it's very easy to oversimplify when you're talking about writing anything. And I'm going to try not to do that, but I'm going to end up oversimplifying, I'm sure. But I think that the mechanics of what's happening is far less important than what the characters feel about what's happening. The eroticism in a sex scene is the intimacy. Yes, you need to be able to describe what they're doing, but as they're doing it, you need to be inside the character. I mean, I think that sex scenes it's absolutely critical that you write in what we call a deep point of view. You need to be inside somebody's head, one of them at least, so that you can experience what they're experiencing. The sensations that they experience when they touch the other person, what they feel when they're touched. And they're all descriptions of sensation and feelings, not necessarily thoughts. And so, yes, you're going to be talking about cradling a breast, for example, but that's not enough. That's mechanical. But what do you feel when you do that? Or how does that person's body feel to you? And that takes a lot of skill to be able to learn to write that. And it's not about moving your left hand to their leg. Every time I see a sex scene where we start talking about left hands and right hands, that needs to go. Okay? I mean, we all have two hands, and sometimes we have three in a sex scene, and that needs to go too. But you really want to stop the choreographing. That really distances the reader from the act.
And now you're just playing a game of Twister.
Sense? Yeah.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I think so. PJ, you want to weigh in on that?
What was the question again? I'm sorry.
We're talking about feelings in sex scenes versus just the activity that's going on.
No, I don't really want to.
Okay, all right then. What about you, Nanisi?
Oh, I love writing sex scenes, but sometimes it's hard. I'm writing one now where my character that is the focus of the scene is being fisted. I've never been fisted. So how do I write about that?
Time for research.
I guess so. But there's a lot of things that you just have to think about. It's not where it feels or how it feels, it's why it feels.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think you're, yeah. What about you, Renee?
I'm still I consider myself still fairly new writer and learning the craft from the ground up. And definitely, I would like to be more into deep POV during sex scenes. I think out of bed, it's easier to be more emotionally in tune to what a character is thinking because you are with them. And I think it's harder to be watching both characters and try to include what they're both feeling during a sex scene. But I think that emotions certainly have to play an integral part of the scene.
You're right. Erin.
Well, I think Rad answered the mechanics versus feelings question, but I do want to touch on what Renee said as far as being in the character. I never write a sex scene I never switch POVs in a sex scene. So when you're writing a sex scene, I think figuring out which POV you're going to be in is maybe one of the first steps. And to me, that's what is this scene revealing? And who is it revealing it about? So that's the POV that I need to be in, the one that's going to give the most information and build the most character for the readers. And then, you know, if there's another scene later in the book, that might be from the other character's perspective. But the key to that scene is giving some information about the character. And so I always write it from the perspective of whichever character I need to develop in that moment, and whichever character oftentimes is most vulnerable in the scene.
That's a good point.
Can I just add, I'm not trying to say one should not be descriptive when you're writing a sex scene. I mean, I think that setting the scene is important, like describing what the lighting is like. If you're right, I mean, it's really important if you're writing a BDSM scene, for example, because the setting and the tension that you create with how one of the characters is positioned, for example. I mean, if you read Shadowlands, there's a lot of descriptive stuff about, you know, where they have sex and how they have sex and what the lighting is like. But, and the same is true for if you're writing a sweet love scene and you know, somebody pulls down the sheet. I mean, there are things that are very sensual that you can describe, but in the act itself, you don't want a lot of, and then she put her, you know, leg between her other leg. And, you know, I mean, it's just not necessary. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about choreographing every single step. But I mean, you want to get all the good stuff in there. Like the fist.
Yeah. There have been times when I'm editing when I have to get out a pen and draw because there seems to be like 5 legs. And I'm like, I think we're getting too technical here if I'm having to get out my dolls and figure out.
Well, you know, some of the stuff you write, maybe there are 5 legs.
No, that could be. I tell everybody if there's a tentacle, you need to tell me right away.
Right.
That's something I need to know. Does sex scenes change over the course of one book? So if you start writing a character's, and maybe you write a really hot scene or something like this in the very beginning, do you maybe morph that into something else later when they're together, when there's feelings flying around? Let's talk about that for a little bit. And let's go with Rad because she nodded at me.
I'm sorry. Oh, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that every love scene changes as the book progresses because the connection between the characters progresses. And I think that writing sex is another form of language. you're telling the reader something about these characters through the way they interact in bed and maybe what they say to each other while they're in bed or after the act. But I think that especially if you, before the I love you scene, the sex, after the I love you, the sex is going to be the sort of culmination of the entire romance arc. It's going to be where you know that they're together now. They're not exploring, they're not testing, they're not checking things out. This is you're telling the reader for sure they're a couple now. So I think that as the book progresses, the intensity won't change, but perhaps the certainty of the characters about what's happening or what has happened changes, because that's part of the conflict. As you introduce, another element of intimacy, particularly sex, you're creating more conflict early in the book.
What about you, Erin?
Yeah, what she said.
Good. That was a good response. But you could have just said, yeah, that's where the fisting happens. Just to add on to that. Renee.
I definitely think it evolves into a different kind of sex. I want to say that the frantic sex tends to be less so and becomes more personalized and connected, if that's a way to describe it. The characters know each other better. They know their likes and their dislikes. They have an understanding of where they are emotionally with each other. The intensity is a different kind of intensity, in my opinion, because I think at the end they're making love rather than having sex. And not that there's anything wrong with just having sex, because that can be good too. But in a romance, it's about the falling for, not only emotionally, but physically too, and that they're interconnected to never be separated maybe again, or to never step back and say, whoa. That happens earlier in books, I think. And it's been interesting because Body Language is my first erotic romance as a novel rather than a short.
I don't think I've ever put a sex scene early in a book. So, but yeah, I mean, it has to change. If you're having sex, when you first meet, it's not going to be the same as it's going to be later when you've gotten to know the other person and have feelings for them.
Going to be more of a slow dance and less of a somebody pulled the fire alarm.
Yeah.
Yeah, some kind of thing. Are you back with us, Nanisi?
I'm here. Yep.
How do your sex scenes evolve over the course of a book?
Well, most of my work most recently is BDSM. The beginning sex scenes are power exchanges. And that's really what it is. This is, I'm in charge and do as I say. Toward the end, it becomes more love making, love showing.
Awesome. I like that idea.
I think too, some of it, a lot of it's character driven, because in what kind of story are you telling? I've written a couple of, both in my most latest anthology and also in a novel. I've written some friends to lovers, and I think you're coming from a different place there because you have two people who already know each other pretty well. So there's already some intimacy there from the beginning, but then you have the added twist of they're changing the context of their relationship, and how does that affect, how does this new level of intimacy affect the existing friendship? So some of it depends on the characters and where they're at in the story.
I quite agree, and it's a very lovely thought, and it's a very lovely thought to end on. I want to thank all of my lovely panelists for talking about sex with me for about 50 minutes. It's been a fun time. And back over to you, Sandy Lowe.
Thanks, Barb.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Barb.
Thanks, everybody. Good to
Bye,
see
guys.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.